some complementarity between the two. So in other words, households that get both pro-campo and oportunidades diversify their agricultural portfolios a little more, take on a bit more risky activity, but they don't get a strong result that way. I also had a student here who finished up a couple years ago, Dylan Fitz, who's now a professor elsewhere, and he worked on the same question in Brazil, and he found some similar kind of effects of, I would call it some weak complementarity between the agrarian policies in Brazil and the Bolsa program there. But the bottom line is that there's no question that rural productivity rises with transfers, but we don't yet know that much from these cases about what the optimal kind of mix would be between a social policy and agrarian policy. Now I want to try to take a sideways step that just touches on a little bit of research that I've done for like 2 minutes. I did a research project in coffee, among coffee co-ops in Oaxaca and Chiapas, where we looked at the household income portfolios and how they were affected by being organic or fair trade coffee. That could be a story for another day. The most important finding from that study with respect to the conversation today is that even among these coffee growing households that compared to many other smallholder households were relatively wealthier, because they have coffee trees, they don't just have cornland, let's just say, we found that their incomes were very diversified. So all these are coffee growing households, and on average they get about 20% of their income from coffee. They get about 20% of their income from subsidies. So right there, the government social policies and the net income they get from coffee were about equivalent. The biggest source of the subsidy income was Oportunidades. But if they have a migrant, either domestic or international, they get 35%, or actually, on average, they get 35%. If they have one, since it's conditional on having one, it's more like usually 70 or 80% of their income would come from that family member who migrated and sent back remittances. So another way of thinking about this is the labor side of these households and what might happen with respect to labor earnings may be much more important in terms of the overall well-being and, the, if you will, the productivity of this household, if you think about productivity not just based on land, but on the labor that those households are putting forward. So 2 more quick studies just to touch on to give you a sense of what we know. One is a study by Susan Parker, where she took the same Oportunidades data, or same Oportunidades program, a different data set, and looked at populations that were in a region where Oportunidades was implemented when young people were 10 to 14, and another set of regions where they weren't getting Oportunidades, and then compares for similar households how those 2 groups of young people did. One where they had access to educational transfer support and others where they didn't, and looks at what it means for their labor market and labor earnings, labor market outcomes and labor earnings later. And she found that, yes, they went to school longer, and there was about a 30% increase in the population attending college, so that says something about mobility. They had a higher probability of employment, but she didn't find that they had any impact on their earnings, at least at that point. But it also doesn't include anybody who was away from home. Okay, so I just told you that migration and remittances was a major source of household income among these sets of households. This particular study is only able to track households and people in those households who are still there. Okay, so if they've gone away somewhere else, they're not there, and so that's a missing piece of what might be the productivity story. And so one more angle on the migration side, and this is a study that just came out this year from a professor at Michigan who looks at the impact of Oportunidades on migration to the U.S. and finds that basically a positive impact just along the lines of the story that I told before. There's evidence that households who got access to Oportunidades in 1997 and households that didn't, for those who did, they were able to go to their village moneylenders usually and get a loan, and that increased the probability of family members migrating to the United States significantly during that time period. And so that the implication is that Oportunidades not only has the anti-poverty impacts on youth or young children and the mothers, but may have implications for the migration behavior of other family members and therefore their welfare. So let me summarize what we know and what we don't know about rural productivity connected to conditional transfers. What we know is that ag productivity rises, so does schooling investment, so does employment, so does migration, and so does earning of rural households when they have remittances. Okay? So we know that. But we don't know do non-farm earnings rise? How do youth earnings rise with that mobility? We can imagine they rise, especially if they have more schooling, but it's not yet documented in these evaluations that have been done. When they do have higher earnings, does this mean that the households are then able to get into a cycle where they're able to educate more, maybe have more members migrate, and I'm not just talking about internationally, migrate within Mexico for better jobs? We presume so, but again, it's not something that's been explored in this kind of study yet. And then overall, how are these rural household portfolios shifting? And this is where the conversation circles back to the rural productivity story if you're thinking about it from agriculture. Because if what people are mostly doing is shifting their emphasis towards investing in human capital, then there's likely to need to be some kind of reorganization of agriculture as well, because there's significant portions of the population who are exiting agriculture, leaving others who may be able to do more with what's there, but that has to be thought of seriously. And then for those households who keep a rural base, even though they have family members leaving, what does it mean to reinvest in agriculture when maybe most of the younger population is going elsewhere, either in the region or beyond for work? Okay. So, Gustavo?
So basically, in one of my early lives, I was a deputy minister of agriculture in Mexico, and also in the agrarian reform ministry. And many of these discussions we had in the 1990s, especially some programs like Procampo. Procampo is a transfer, a cash transfer, which is given to farmers based on the number of acres they have. So we had put a cap of 20 hectares, so that would be, 20 hectares would be around 80 acres as a cap. But the cap went very far up, and now you have this transfer program very regressive, because if you have more land, then obviously you get more money on that. So that's one problem you have always with policy design, is that you have unintended consequences of your policy design. Now, when we were discussing on Progresa, the first part that came in Mexico in 1996, and then its equivalent in Brazil, it started with Bolsa Escola, which was basically a program of transfer for schooling. Not until 2002, with Lula, did the program in Brazil take the form of the Progresa in Mexico, which included schooling, health, and food security as well. So the discussion we have had in the past years, and there's two texts that I very much recommend. The 2015 State of Food Agriculture just appeared a few months ago on social protection and agriculture. How to break the cycle of rural poverty, that's the text. And it's a very, it's worldwide. It has a lot of examples from Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And then the study I made with another colleagues on strengthening links between agriculture and social protection programs in Mexico. And we took a longer view. We took 1970 to 2012 to see why do social policy programs do not coordinate with agriculture production programs. So what's the problem we've been having there? And one very important thing that we also know, both in Mexico and in Brazil, and I think in most of the cash transfer programs in Latin America, is that in absence of other policies who do not have to do anything with rural policies, you will not have a reduction in poverty. And the case of Mexico is important. We had around 30-something% of poor population in 1992, and you have more or less that same percentage, which means more poor people in 2012. So the discussion from the government point of view, and from the civil society, of course, is what have we done wrong? What's the problem? Why is it that having that program, we do not reduce poverty? Now, the second part of the puzzle is that, nevertheless, the reduction of poverty, of rural poverty, in Brazil has been incredibly high up to 2010, more or less, and with the same program. So then there's something that the Brazilians did that the Mexicans didn't do. So what's that? Well, it has to do with other type of policy. For example, Brazil had a very strong minimum wage program to increase minimum wage. Brazil had a very strong program on rural employment, which Mexico did not have. Brazil had a very strong program in terms of Social Security for the rural inhabitants. So if you are 65, 66 years, and you're living in the countryside in Brazil, you automatically get a pension, which you don't have in Mexico. It's a non-contributive pension. So that is to say, it's not that the rural population contribute to that pension when they're working. It's something that is contributed by the rest of the population via taxes and via expenditures. So then that's the question basically. How do we combine social policies, of which cash transfers are very crucial and will be very crucial because of the reasons that Brad just mentioned, but how do you link that with rural productive policies? And that's more or less the discussion we had with this. Now, in the case of Mexico, we had three interlinked problems. A very slow reduction of rural poverty, which is what I'm saying. Basically, you had 34% of the population in 1992, and you have 31% of the population in 2012 in terms of rural poverty. Then you have a low growth of agricultural productivity, especially in small farmers. And our comparison with Chile and with Brazil is incredible. Mexico increased in aggregate value per worker in agriculture by 52%, while Chile 260%, Brazil 380%. And if you compare with East Asian countries, for example, South Korea, you'll have an incredible, stronger productivity increase in small farmers. So basically what I'm saying, and I've said it a long time as a policy person in Mexico, is that we should have been looking more to East Asian countries in terms of agriculture. Why? Because the agrarian structure in Mexico is very similar to the one in Asia. It's based on small farmers. It's based on small farmers. I mean, the biggest landlord that we have right now in Mexico, illegally, I mean, that can happen, but legally is 100 hectares. So that means 400 acres. That's the biggest land you can have in Mexico legally. The biggest land you can have in Brazil is 4 million acres. And I've seen one of those little farms there. No? So there is a difference in terms of a structure. But in South Korea, in Taiwan, in China, in Japan, in Thailand, the average acres are more or less similar to Mexico. In fact, it's smaller than in Mexico. So you have to look more in there, what have they been doing well that we have not done well, to analyze the productivity. And very importantly, you have a double coordination failure in terms of public expenditure. One, you do not link social policy with productive interventions. You have it completely separated. And secondly, you have components of the productive intervention also not coordinated. And you have a problem, a real problem, something that what Brad was saying. So you can transfer the cash program is transfers to women, basically, because the argument has been, if you want to be sure that that money gets to the kids, you have to be sure that it will get through the mothers, and that's what you want to do. But the Procampo, the other program that's in the agricultural sector, is transfers as well, but for men. So what do you have in some areas where you have small rural employment, that means for men, and strong social policies that are transferred to women? Yeah, you change the negotiation powers, but then you have a problem. And we detected very clearly, intra-family violence increased in those areas in an incredible number. That is not to say that you don't have to transfer money to women, and in this case, it's another problem, but it is there. So yes, the bargaining powers change quite a bit, and this is something you also have to take into consideration. So my argument is not, just to be sure on that, my argument is not that you don't transfer to women. I mean, the effectiveness of those transfers are beyond question. All the evaluations say that. The discussion is more, how can you be sure to protect the gained bargaining powers that women have gained because of this type of programs? That's mainly my argument. And in rural and public expenditures, you have one reduction in absolute, this is in Mexico, the reduction in absolute terms in general of public expenditure in the rural areas. Then you have reduction in productive subsidies, so you have gone more to the social side rather than to productive side. Then you have more private transfers that on rural expenditure. That is to say, you have more transfers that go to private activities of big agricultural owners rather than to public issues, for example, warehouses, rural roads, and so research and development and so on. So it's highly regressive. I had a map where you have, as you grow in number of hectares, you get more and more subsidies, which isn't a crazy thing to do. I mean, subsidies are supposed to help resolve problems of market failures and supposed to help especially those which are in smaller, poorer, and so on. And so it's the other way around. And then you have the technology of capturing rents. This happens in all families, in all good families. It happens. It happens here in the States. It happens in Europe. It happens everywhere. But the dimension of the capturing of rents is incredibly big in Latin America and incredibly big in Mexico. So that's something that necessarily you have to resolve. So you have to confront fragmentation. Focus more on multi-activities, because that's another area which we found very strongly. When you analyze rural household incomes, what you find out in all Latin America, strongly in Mexico and in Brazil, is that the non-agricultural income in the households, rural households, is increasingly more important than the agricultural income in, obviously, very small farmers. So what you need to have is a policy to address not only the agricultural side, but the non-agricultural side in the rural areas, which has to do very much with transformation, which has to do to the other service activities in the rural area. Then you have, and then for the very poor people, transfers from the government, such as Progresa was its first name, then Oportunidades is its second name, and now in third revival is called Prospera. So, but it's the same program, only with different aspects, which I'm going to discuss a little bit. You need to have a basic social protection for everyone. And I see the example of the Brazilians with the pension program as one. It's expensive, but it's crucial. I would say if you link most of the programs and analyze it in that base, you would have a very strong program. A combined package of productive and technical assistance for small farmers, which is something that we found different. We were thinking when we were doing policies in Mexico from the early 50s and 60s, we were thinking of United States. There's no way we can compete with United States, with Iowa. Impossible. There's no way. The land in Mexico is not flat. The quality of land, so we cannot compete there. We have an incredible amount of natural resources. That's where we compete. Or in tropical fruits, that's where we compete. So we had to look more on other areas which were more similar to what we have in Mexico. And then you need to have a permanent training mechanisms in knowledge and abilities as well. So the new components of social policy in the last years are basically three. One is called the Crusade Against Hunger. It focused on extreme poverty and food insecure population. both urban and rural. It has it targets 7 million households in rural and urban areas which are food insecure. What's the main criticism of that program? Basically, that it has, which is the main criticism you can make to most policy programs, social policy programs. If you start putting a lot of aims and purposes of the program, what you have is a Christmas tree. You don't have a policy program that is focused on one or two. When you put too much things in one program, you end up not doing any of that. Secondly, the reform Oportunidades, which is now called Prospera, expanding its scope in human capital and adding a productive dimension, which is not being done by the program, but basically what the program is looking at is how can we pull programs that are related to productive rural activities to the area in which Oportunidades Prospera is now working. And thirdly, I participate in the design and the implementation of this program that started only this year, which is a pilot, productive territories, to learn on combinations of social and productive intervention. Because the main point is that we do not know. That's the clear thing. We do not know how to link policy interventions in terms of the social area and in terms of the productive area. We do not know. And it's in general. I mean, not Mexico, it's not America, it's in general. So we need to experiment and see in a learning process how can you link one and another. And obviously we have normally short memories in terms of policy. We have to look back to the things we thought that were completely overturned by technology, by new learning and so on. Well, there are things that are in the 40s and the 50s who are still very important, and we have to look at that as well again. So basically, the end story of this thing is that we have to learn quite a bit, and we have to learn both on the policy side, which is the side I'm working, and in the academic side, which is the side which Brad is working. So thank you very much.
Thanks everybody who came in, whatever classes you came in from. You definitely multiplied our impact.
From whoever professor is going to give you a grade, thank you.
Your lectures called attention to the competition of big ag corporations against small farmers. In part, there may also be soybeans competing with black beans. And here two experiences. One from Brazil, I heard that the black beans have become scarcer. The other, a very personal experience from Central America. Half a century ago in El Salvador, we ate black beans 3 times a day. And only Costa Rica, they had a dish they called the gallo pinto, had nothing to do with the chicken. No, the name, don't get confused. It was a mingle of black beans, but mainly in rice. Now, half a century later, coming back to El Salvador, black beans, no, it was gallo pinto what they ate. So, all that, I sort of see that's part of the picture of something imposed from pressure from outside that makes the traditional good life different.
Yeah, no, I think the main, if you want to say the one word, the problem we have had in the last 20, 25 years is the type of policies who do not recognize the importance of food security in each country and recognize the type of foods you have in each country. Obviously, soybeans gives an incredible amount of money for Brazil, but it doesn't mean that that money goes to the Brazilian people. So that's a problem. And secondly, up to 2007, you could argument that food agriculture prices were going down. It was completely that. So you would argument if they're going to go down, what's the need of producing everything in your country? You can buy it, and you can buy it even cheaper. Yeah, true, until 2007. Then you have the prices of the agriculture prices, and then you recognize that you have, in a new world, you are very, very possible of having a problem of getting food at whatever price you have. For example, black beans, to mention just one, there's no international market on that. If you want to get black beans, you have to make a contract agriculture with 2 years in advance. So we have a situation. Mexico had been a strong producer of black beans. In the 3 or 4 years ago, we didn't have enough black beans to to give our population. So we had to buy.
Do you eat gallo pinto?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, but did you do that 50 years ago?
Yeah, not too much now,
Okay.
because you have a problem. The problem is that now you have to import the black beans from South Africa, which is that foolish thing if you can produce it here. So then that's the type of problem you have with that type of policy. Yes.
Yeah, very different question. I came late, so maybe you covered this. But, you know, repatriating money, you mentioned in one of your slides that a lot of the percentage of the household was from repatriating money. My question deals with things like PayPal. They actually take 3.5% out of your whatever money you receive as a fee for them, you know, processing the transfer of money. I was just wondering if the Mexican government has a program where they could actually do the repatriation and having the people that get the money get more money. Because the millions and millions of dollars are lost because of the bank fees that they charge to repatriate people's money.
Yeah, you're completely correct. You know, the point is that, just to give an example of how important remittances are. In Mexico, the first source of external income was normally oil. With the oil prices going down, and then secondly it was tourism, and third it was auto cars, and fourth it was remittances. That was normally until 2012. Right now, remittances is the first source of external income, stronger than oil. So it's huge.
Yes.
Now, the problem is that, for example, you have basically 3 or 4 companies who are doing the transfer of funds. One, Western Union, and one Mexican, very strong, one of the 3 richest persons in Mexico. And they are charging incredible amounts of that, of a big bill. You know? And no, the government hasn't done any. Actually, the government has been very remiss in analyzing the impact that might have remittances. They have it in the private market, no? But accompanied by public policy, they would have a much more stronger impact. They don't have, and yes, it's a business of 2 or 3 companies who are doing that.
I mean, there are some efforts to innovate in that regard. I mean, one that I'm familiar with is that credit unions around the country have set up links between credit unions in the U.S. and credit unions in Mexico to lower those fees. And so, I don't know how widespread the adoption or the participation of Mexican migrants in the U.S. is in those, but they would definitely face much lower fees than they would face for the Western Union or the company that Gustavo referred to. But probably with a little bit more public policy support, it won't work as well. But,
You've clarified very nicely a number of the interlinkages between poverty reduction and the sources of income and productivity. And you've talked a lot about agents, private NGOs, government agencies. Have you seen some areas where there are successful interlinkages between agencies and programs that are trying to achieve the same outcome?
Yes. And they haven't They're very diversified experiences. So you cannot have very general conclusions on that. But one conclusion that you can have is this. Mainly when you have the possibility of coordinating agencies, public and private, is when you do it at the local level. So then